Have you ever noticed how in almost every group, there's at least one person who speaks very little? They're present, listening, sometimes smiling or nodding, but rarely jumping into the conversation. This happens at meetings, family gatherings, classrooms, and even among friends. People often assume silence means shyness, lack of confidence, or disinterest, but psychology suggests something more nuanced is going on. Silence in groups isn't random, and it's not always a weakness. It's often the result of how people process information, manage social risk, and understand their own role in a group. When you look at this behavior through a psychological lens, it becomes less mysterious and more predictable. Today, we'll calmly unpack why some people stay quiet in groups and what psychology says about this very common human pattern. One important reason people stay silent in groups is related to how they process information. Some individuals have a naturally higher cognitive load when they're in social settings. Cognitive load simply refers to how much mental effort the brain is using at a given moment. In group conversations, there are multiple voices, facial expressions, shifting topics, and unspoken social rules happening all at once. For some people, especially those who think deeply before speaking, the brain prioritizes understanding over responding. Psychologists often link this to reflective thinking styles. These individuals prefer to internally organize their thoughts before sharing them, which can take longer than the pace of the conversation allows. By the time they feel ready to speak, the topic may have already moved on. Silence in this case is not disengagement. It's a sign that the person's mental resources are focused on comprehension rather than quick expression. Another psychological factor is something known as evaluation apprehension. This refers to the awareness that others are watching and judging what we say. In group settings, especially unfamiliar or hierarchical ones, this feeling can become stronger. People who are sensitive to social evaluation often run their thoughts through an internal filter before speaking. They subconsciously ask themselves whether their comment is useful, accurate, or socially acceptable. Research shows that this self-monitoring can reduce spontaneous speech. The person may decide that staying silent feels safer than risking embarrassment or misunderstanding. This isn't the same as low confidence. It's more about emotional regulation. Silence becomes a way to manage potential social discomfort by reducing exposure to judgment. Silence in groups is also linked to self-concept clarity, which is how clearly and confidently someone understands who they are and what they think. People with high self-concept clarity tend to speak up more easily because they feel stable in their opinions. Those with lower self-concept clarity may still be intelligent and thoughtful, but they experience more internal uncertainty about how their views will be received. In group conversations, especially on abstract or value-based topics, this uncertainty can lead to silence. Psychology suggests that when people are still forming or refining their views, they often prefer listening over speaking. Silence allows them to observe others, compare perspectives, and internally adjust their own understanding without committing publicly to a position. Group dynamics also play a major role. Social psychology shows that people unconsciously assess their role in a group very quickly. If someone perceives that others are more dominant, louder, or more knowledgeable, they may adopt a quieter role. This is linked to something called social role theory. Groups naturally develop informal roles, like leader, mediator, observer, or challenger. Once someone senses that their role is to observe or support rather than lead the conversation, they may speak less without consciously deciding to do so. Silence becomes part of how they fit into the group structure. This is especially common in groups where a few voices tend to dominate early on. There's also a strong connection between silence and locus of control. This refers to whether people feel outcomes are influenced more by their own actions or by external forces. Individuals with a more external locus of control in social settings may feel that speaking up won't change the direction of the conversation anyway. They may think the group has already decided what matters, who leads, or which opinions carry weight. As a result, they conserve energy by staying quiet. This isn't apathy. It's a learned response based on past experiences where speaking didn't feel impactful. Over time, silence becomes an efficient strategy rather than a passive one. Temperament plays a role as well, particularly the difference between introversion and extroversion. Introversion is often misunderstood as shyness, but psychology defines it differently. Introverted individuals tend to be more internally oriented. They gain energy from reflection rather than stimulation. In group conversations, especially fast-paced ones, they may feel mentally drained more quickly. Silence helps regulate that stimulation. Extroverts, on the other hand, often think while speaking, using conversation to shape their ideas. Introverts usually think before speaking, which naturally results in fewer contributions. Neither style is better. They simply reflect different ways the brain manages energy and attention. Interestingly, silence can also be connected to the Dunning-Kruger effect, but in a subtle way. This effect describes how people with less knowledge in a domain may overestimate their understanding, while those with more knowledge are often more aware of what they don't know. In group discussions, people who understand the complexity of a topic may hesitate to speak because they recognize nuance, uncertainty, and missing information. Meanwhile, more confident speakers may not feel the same restraint. From a psychological perspective, silence can sometimes signal intellectual humility rather than lack of insight. The quiet person may be mentally weighing multiple possibilities instead of presenting a simplified opinion. Cultural and environmental learning further shapes this behavior. In some families, classrooms, or workplaces, speaking less is subtly rewarded. Children who learn that interrupting or challenging others leads to negative reactions often grow into adults who value listening over speaking. Psychology calls this social conditioning. Over time, silence becomes associated with respect, safety, or competence. When these individuals enter new group settings, they carry that learned behavior with them, even if the environment no longer requires it. When you put all of this together, silence in groups looks less like a personal flaw and more like an adaptive response. It reflects how someone processes information, manages emotion, reads social cues, and protects their mental energy. Psychology doesn't frame silence as something that must be fixed. Instead, it treats it as one of many valid ways humans navigate complex social environments. So the next time you notice someone staying quiet in a group, or you recognize this pattern in yourself, it can help to see it differently. Silence doesn't always mean uncertainty, weakness, or lack of interest. Often it means observation, regulation, and thoughtful engagement happening internally rather than out loud. Understanding this behavior allows us to interpret group dynamics more accurately and with less judgment. If you enjoy learning how psychology explains everyday human behavior like this, consider subscribing for more calm, clear explorations of how the mind works in real life.